Hey y'all, Dave from the Coop. Me and Connie are going to share a book with y'all, and it's called The Elves and The Shoemaker. This was one of Cade, my grandson's favorite stories when he was little. A lot of people have the big, thick fairy tale books filled with all the different fairy tale stories. Well, Cade would always pick this one out, it seemed like, at night before we went to bed. This story was collected by the Brothers Grimm and added to their fairy tale collection in about 1812. The story that I'm going to share with you is a little golden book, but it was published in 1983, but it was retold by Eric Suben, and the illustrations are done by Annie Wan. But they are beautiful. I love them. I love this story. This is a classic fairy tale about two selfless shoemaking little elves that show the joy that comes from giving, receiving, generosity, and kindness. So me and Connie, we hope that you enjoy this story, The Elves and the Shoemaker. The Elves and the Shoemaker, retold by Eric Suben and illustrated by Annie Wan. Once upon a time, there was a kind shoemaker. Though he worked very hard, he grew poorer and poorer. The day came when he had only enough leather left to make one last pair of shoes. He cut the leather for the shoes and left it on his workbench to stitch together the next morning. The shoemaker went to bed not knowing what he and his wife would do once the leather was used up, for they had no money to buy more. Despite their troubles, the shoemaker and his wife slept soundly that night. Early the next morning, the shoemaker woke up and got dressed. Then he went into the shop to make the last pair of shoes. When he looked at his workbench, the shoemaker thought he must be dreaming. He blinked his eyes, then blinked them again, but this was not a dream. On that very spot where he had left the leather the night before was a pair of beautiful, well-made shoes, all finished. The shoemaker called his wife into the shop and showed her the shoes. "They're splendid!" she exclaimed. "When did you make them?" "I didn't make them," the shoemaker replied. "I found them here this morning." The shoemaker put the shoes in the shop window. Soon the door swung open and a fine gentleman walked in. "I must have these wonderful shoes," he said. "I've never seen any like them. The stitches are so small and delicate." The shoemaker sold the shoes to the gentleman, who paid a very high price for them. With the money, the shoemaker was able to buy enough leather to make 2 more pairs of shoes and a nice big soup bone for dinner. That night, the shoemaker cut out the leather of the shoes, but he was very hungry and he could smell the delicious soup his wife was cooking. "I'll make the shoes tomorrow," he said, and then went to eat dinner. The next morning, he found 2 pairs of elegant shoes on the workbench. He showed them to his wife. "Who can be making these marvelous shoes?" she asked. But the shoemaker only shook his head in wonder. Once again, the shoemaker placed the shoes in the shop window. He didn't have long to wait before the door swung open. This time, there were 2 customers, and they both paid handsomely for the fine shoes. Now the shoemaker had enough money to buy leather for 4 more pairs of shoes. Things went on this way for some time. Each night, the shoemaker cut the leather and went to sleep, and every morning he found more beautiful shoes on his workbench. The shoemaker and his wife were no longer poor. They sold so many pairs of shoes that little by little they began to save money. One evening, the shoemaker said to his wife, "It's nearly Christmas, and we still don't know who is sewing all these shoes for us. We cannot go another day without finding out who it is." So together, the shoemaker and his wife thought of a plan. Instead of going to sleep that night, they hid behind a curtain in the shop. At midnight, two tiny elves skipped through the door and into the shop. The shoemaker and his wife watched in amazement as the elves quickly began to stitch and sew. Soon the workbench was filled with handsome new shoes. But the moment their work was finished, the elves vanished. The shoemaker and his wife were astonished. They decided they must do something for the tiny creatures who had been so kind to them. The elves were not wearing any coats or hats or shoes, said the wife. The poor little things must get very cold at this time of year. So the shoemaker and his wife made two tiny suits of clothing for the elves. The next night they laid out the little clothes they had made, then hid behind the curtain once more. At exactly midnight, the elves appeared in the shop. When they saw the new clothes, they were overjoyed. They hurried to try on their outfits and found that everything fit them perfectly. In their brand new clothes, the elves danced around the room and sang a merry song. At last, the elves danced out the door of the shoemaker's shop, never to return again. The thoughtful shoemaker and his good wife had repaid kindness with kindness. They never wanted for anything and lived happily for the rest of their days.